people that are looking into what are new and exciting new materials. How can we find them? Now you can imagine if you put a couple of hundred scientists into a wet lab and have them all simulate or actually create new materials. This comes expensive and it is a very, very slow process. So it was the idea of the computational material scientists to actually try and figure out a way to simulate a couple of these properties that make materials their specific or make materials usable for specific use cases. So how do they do that? Well, they first start out with a general idea of a material. They will then create a virtual representation of that material that they then distribute onto a HPC cluster where the really resource intensive simulations for all of these material science questions are then run. And out falls some type of a representation. In our case, it is usually the density of states, where they then will see different things from their view as a domain scientist, and judging from that output that they gotten in the first pass, they will then have to make a couple of decisions. Maybe the initially chosen representation, the geometry, was just wrong, so the system did not yet converge to a stable system. Or maybe it's just a super boring material, and we already know materials that do these things a lot better. If you consider, for example, something like battery materials or materials for photovoltaics, maybe there's already better systems known, so they will have to then switch out this what we have here as a blue atom to become a green atom, and then run this loop again and again. At some point, they will be happy with their results, and they can then calculate and simulate with these results some further properties that are based on this density of states that falls out of this first pass. So in a nutshell, if I can actually switch, there we go. In a nutshell, these computational material science workflows are firstly human in the loop, very much so, because they need to decide, is this a good system? Is it not a good system? They are also very resource intensive. So if we're saying we're using an HPC cluster here, some of these calculations, some of these simulations take several months on a HPC cluster. So it's really resource intensive. The next problem that we face is that these density functional theory codes, which they just call codes, are usually all monolithic. So it's really hard for us to scale and split it up. And the last really big problem that we see is that we have to deal with numerical approximations. Almost none of the actual simulations that we see can be solved analytically. So we have to deal with numerical approximations. And if we deal with numerical approximations, especially in a field that is something like 20 years old at this point, in a global field, then we come up with not just one of these codes, but unfortunately, the picture looks more like this. We have a package here in the middle. So this package in the middle is basically the entire workflow that I showed on the slide before. And unfortunately, we can choose from a long list. In the middle here, there's like 45 different DFT codes that can be used in computational material science. So the workflow is a bit more bloated. We have to first generate our idea into a computer readable input. We will then have to put that input into a script so that we can then use our chosen DFT code. Every single one does things a little bit differently. Maybe the simulation is going deeper. Maybe there is some other approximation, and all of these codes have their own data format. So we then come to this script here at the back, which the physicists call a parser, a CMS code parser. I know this is not particularly what we as computer scientists understand as a parser. This is more like a transpiler. We translate from the proprietary output format into a standard format. And as the last couple of presentations, especially I think it was Sven's before lunch, these codes are all basically written by physicists who maybe not have enjoyed the luxury that we have of a formal computer science and software engineering education. So there is basically no testing done in these scripts. These scripts are just built and built for, okay, if they work on this file, they surely must work on every other file. So this is where we come in. We are actually fuzzing these particular parsers. So we have built a tool, and I would like to give a short overview to that tool now. Obviously, if we're fuzzing in a grammar-based way, a tool, we first start with a grammar. We then generate from that grammar some inputs. We will then, at the end, run these inputs through the tool to check, do we actually find any crashes or issues? So let's take a couple of minutes to look into each of these steps. Let's start with the CFL grammar. If we are looking at the CFL grammar, it looks something like this. Obviously, this is just a part of a really, really big grammar for one of the main output files of the parsers that we've chosen. And we've intentionally omitted a couple of lines here just to A, fit it to the slide, and B, actually show you what happens to a certain part, in this case, the num-piece down here, in later steps. So when we're talking about grammars, in our case, we have built these grammars manually. We have generated these grammars from samples and ignored the parsers themselves. Why did we do that? Well, we ignored the parsers themselves to specifically capture edge cases that are not exactly matched by the parser. So we used samples from the NOMAD database to generate manually those grammars that I showed an example of earlier. Now we have those grammars now. Okay, what can we do with that? Well, in the next step, we obviously want to generate new inputs from this very, very abstract grammar file. And how do we do that? Well, we use a tool called Tribble. Tribble, that is a state-of-the-art grammar-based fuzzer, which allows us to use probabilistic context-free grammars, and B, it also allows us the seeding of these runs. Now, don't be afraid, we are not using static seeds to actually seed these runs, but it allows us something that Arne will talk about a bit later on. So how does it look when we have generated our files? Well, these files look similar to what we have seen before. So the structure is still the same, but in many cases you will see that there is random values, or there's dates, or maybe even a random string somewhere. What we also see is that floats are still as a special token in here. Now, why is that? Our next step in the tool is actually the so-called floatifier, where we are inserting floats. Why are we separating that? So it looks something like that when we are finally done. Well, there is a couple of instances where these parsers are expecting different notations of these floats. In particular, the positional, where you just have the dot at some point, and the scientific notation with the exponential notation. And in different parts of the files, these parsers expect different parts of or different notations. So for one, it is being done because these floats are handled differently in different positions. And to capture this with a grammar, while possible, it would become very, very bloated. If we're just using a quick Python script to exchange those positional or exponential notations, it is much easier to write this, and it becomes much more understandable. Secondly, we are able to generate more diverse floats if we are using a quick Python script. Now, since we have the full input files, we can now actually run our input files through the actual parsers themselves and see if there is any interesting things happening. And maybe one quick side note here, we're using a probabilistic grammar. Why are we using a probabilistic grammar? Well, our grammars are intentionally underfitting the expected format of the parsers. Why are we intentionally underfitting? Well, it is easy to see that if we are just using the same exact grammar, that we wouldn't be able to find certain problems with these parsers. So we would just test if the parsers are actually working well in their small little point of view that they're actually intended to. We wouldn't, however, find what happens if there's unexpected behavior happening somewhere in the tool chain before. So we intentionally underfit, so we left in a couple of random strings, for example. So if there's, just as a quick example, if there is a atomic symbol somewhere, we intentionally left in the possibility that there's a random string instead of just an atomic symbol. We, however, are using biases against these intentional underfits so that we don't always have this, so that we only have a couple of input files that are actually using these rejection sources. And then the last remaining couple of minutes, Arne is now going to talk a bit about our experimental results, as well as some lessons learned for the community. Arne.
Thank you for the nice introduction. So the first part is our experimental results. We first ran 3,000 files for each parser and obtained some successful, some failing, and some crashing runs. The interesting part here is we have both successful runs for each parser and crashing runs for each parser. And first, a quick definition: a successful run in our context is one that only has standard out and no standard error, so that we didn't throw any exceptions. And a crashing run has only standard error and no standard out, and usually really died because of an uncaught exception, so there could not even be any standard out. Then on the next slide, we have our error classification. For the 3,000 files, we have a lot more than 3,000 errors because many of them are just caught and reported. But we found, most importantly, 6 very critical bugs in the VAS parser where they took inputs from the file literally and just allowed claiming huge chunks of memory. One input was only several bytes large, and well, several kilobytes large, and tried to claim over 8 petabytes of main memory, which might be a problem if a malicious attacker knows that such a problem exists. Then we have downstream errors. Those downstream errors are when a tool further down the pipeline expects some input that can't be obtained because the input was never generated in the first part. We have logic errors where we try to call a tool. Well, the parser tries to call a tool and gives a malformed input, and that tool usually crashes. And then we have semantic and syntactic errors. Semantic errors, very simple. We use the context-free language. We can only encode so many semantic constraints. Most of them can't be encoded. And the syntactic errors are because of our intentional underfitting and our sample-based approach. Then next come the lessons learned for the community. The first lesson, Sebastian already cut into this a little. Many grammar-based fuzzing approaches use the golden truth grammar that was used to generate the parser itself, to test the parser, which essentially does not test the parser, except for maybe some handwritten additions to it or some handwritten semantic constraints on top of it, but only tests the parser generator, which is probably not what we want to achieve. Because of this problem, we wrote our own independent grammar to try to catch more edge cases. Next, we have reproducibility. We fuzz, and fuzzing really generates random values. And that is okay, that is fine, but we want to be able to directly and exactly reproduce some inputs, which will be more important in later points. But because of that, we obtain seeds, and well, we seed the random generator and record those seeds. Then the next point is disk space. In the CMS domain, files tend to be pretty large, well, relatively large. Input files are between a few kilobyte to a few megabyte, which is okay. Output files can grow to, well, as I already said, it tried to claim over 8 petabyte, and our server just could not support that. We had one output file that could be supported that generated an empty list of several gigabytes. It was 31 gigabytes of size, which should explain why we tried to remove that and just added reproduction fingerprints. Reproduction fingerprints are a collection of all the seeds and information that is required to reproduce a file. Then the next point is a bit more organizational. We use Python for our tool, and Python explicitly tells you that the pseudo-random number generator that it uses may be changed every Python version. So that is the reason why we expressly fix the version of the pseudo-random number generator using Python's backwards compatibility options, which can be set on the seeding of the generator and on the generation of the generator. And lastly, to reproducibility, we have efficiency. And as you probably know, a random generator has to execute the exact same steps in the exact same order to reach the exact same results. And this might be feasible for small parts, but if you want to regenerate one file of after several thousand runs and exactly one file, in our example, it would be we generate 3,000 files, and if we want to regenerate the last file, we would have to first generate 30 packages of 100 files using Dribble, and then decorate 2,999 other files with floats before we can decorate the last file, which is why we used hierarchic random generators. The upper layer is seeding the runs, the next layer is seeding Dribble, and the float generator. And the float generator has its own random number generator, so that it is easy to decompose. And another interesting thing we gained by that is that we can generate structurally same files with different values, which can be interesting to try to pinpoint a bug. Let's assume we have a bug and are not sure if it is because the input file has the wrong structure or if it's because of values in the input file. Then we can just say, okay, we take this file and just iterate through different values in the file and see if the bug still exists or if we found different bugs. This just requires that some parts of the generation process have to be split apart. And the last point is about reusability, which is a pretty simple point. Our tool was built as a standalone tool to evaluate our approach only, which which is not good for reusability. This is why we started adding parameters when we were already working on different parts to enable it being used in a pipeline similarly to how we used a Dribble. The most important and the most obvious thing we did was adding a way to add a static seed to the generation process so that it can be used in the same vein as we use Dribble right now. And with this, the lessons learned are over, and it has been an honor to present to you Fuzzing Computational Material Science Code Parsers. And it seems we have quite a bit of time for questions left. Are there any?